Hello, hello. So good morning. We were just getting started here today. I am Audrey from the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, and I'll be moderating this next session. So whether it is the morning, the afternoon, or perhaps the middle of the night, wherever you're coming from or calling in from, thank you for taking the time to join us for panel 3 of the GNET conference. For the next 75 minutes, our crew will tackle the topic of violent extremist organizations and their responses to COVID-19. So I will introduce our 4 excellent panelists in just a moment, but first I'd like to frame up our discussion for today and sort of scope out our conversation. So over the last year and some change, both as individuals and as organizations, we've all shifted our day-to-day operations because of the pandemic. As I moderate this discussion from home rather than the office, possibly with my microwave in the background, I'm really reminded of how lucky we all are because we can operate in an environment where we can adapt, we're able to use technology to supplement in-person engagements, and we can regularly connect with colleagues and friends all over the world, really including today's conference. So at the same time, many counterterrorism stakeholders face greater challenges because of the pandemic. So just to offer an example, the Syrian Democratic Forces in Syria really grapple with tough personnel decisions. So if you have limited security forces, should you sort of dedicate them to support the COVID response? Should you have them focus on various security challenges? Should you have them proactively go after the Islamic State with counterterrorism operations? These are tough calls, but counterterrorism actors around the world regularly grapple with similar decisions. And sometimes choices in this domain can create inadvertent gaps in security. So meanwhile, we have extremist groups who are also adapting, evolving, and seizing opportunities afforded by this environment. So to more effectively combat terrorism in the future, it helps to know more about how violent extremist groups are leveraging and responding to COVID-19. Thankfully, we have 4 speakers today that can help us do just that. So first, we're going to have Marc-André Argentino. And Mr. Argentino is a research fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization. And he's a PhD candidate in the individualized program at Concordia University. His research examines how extremist groups leverage technology to create propaganda, recruit members to ideological causes, and inspire acts of violence. And impact democratic institutions. So after that, we'll have Dr. Michael Loadenthal. Dr. Loadenthal is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Cincinnati. Dr. Loadenthal is also executive director of the Peace and Justice Studies Association at Georgetown University, and he's the founding director of the Prosecution Project. Next up, after that, we'll have Chelsea Daymon. Ms. Daymon is pursuing her PhD at American University and is a graduate research fellow at the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab in the Center of University Excellence at American University. Her research interests include terror groups' use of the internet, social media, and encrypted platforms, communications of extremism and extremist innovation online, foreign fighters, and radicalization. She's also the executive producer of the Loopcast podcast. Tabitha Mwangi is currently completing her master's at the University of Geneva, where her thesis investigated the impact of COVID-19 on counterterrorism operations in the Horn of Africa. She's also a fellow with the African Leadership Center at King's College London. So now that is more than enough for me. So let's get ready to dive in for today. Each of the panelists will present for about 7 minutes, and then we're going to open up to questions. So first up, we're going to have Marc-André. Over to you.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Audrey. I just need you to enable screen bar sharing.
Give me 1 second. Of course, this is happening live, but sorry. If any of you guys are familiar with this process, I'm not a Zoom user, so let's see, I'm looking at the functions. I'm sorry for everybody in our audience. Actually,
Click
Dr.
on
Lund, if we want to have somebody else go for now, I can fix those functionalities in the meantime. Dr. Loadenthal, do you have slides for your presentation?
I did, yeah.
Okay. Chelsea, do you?
I don't.
I think it, do you have a little button on the bottom that says security?
I do
Our
not.
screens look, do you have one that says participants? There should be a button that says enable screen sharing. I just don't remember what it is, because if you make me a co-host, I can do it.
Let's just to keep things moving along, I'm going to have Chelsea go ahead, and in the meantime, I will get that ready to rock. Thank you for your help, and again, thank you everybody for your patience. Teams users over here at West Point, so sorry about that.
Hi, everyone. So actually, I'm glad I'm going first because I'm sort of doing an overview of how terrorist groups and extremist groups have been manipulating and using COVID-19 for their benefits. In my research, I'm seeing almost 5 categories of how groups, extremist groups, and movements are benefiting off of COVID-19 and the pandemic. These are originally some on the ground advancements. I will focus more on jihadist groups since I know some of the other speakers are going to be focusing more on the far right and other conspiracy theorists and so forth. So yes, on the ground, some advancements. We saw this especially earlier on in the pandemic. ISIS gained some more ground after losing a lot of it. Then the main thing, especially in the online world, and since this is GNET, is the pandemic being used as a propaganda tool. And this is to promote both existing narratives and also new ones like conspiracy theories. Community outreach has been something else we've seen on all ideological perspectives, so jihadist, far right, etc. And this can be anything from providing services that a government cannot, or even public awareness about things to do with the virus. The fourth would be like the heightened spread of othering narratives. I mean, this is something common that we see in general in propaganda from terrorist and extremist groups, but we are seeing a lot of othering narratives being born out of the pandemic. And then, as Audrey has said, in our technologically advanced world and interconnected world, all of us are using the internet a lot more, which has provided somewhat of a recruitment tool for extremist organizations surrounding the pandemic, since they know that just like all of us are online, they're online, everybody's online right now. So earlier on in the pandemic, we saw various different narratives being promoted in propaganda from both jihadists and the far right. Like I said, I'll focus more on the jihadists. Originally, there was this concept that the virus, that the pandemic was an act of God. So a punishment by God on the groups or countries that say like ISIS or Al-Qaeda were considering enemies. Later on, that narrative changed slightly when it became obvious that the virus was affecting everyone across the world, including in countries and strongholds of extremist and terrorist groups. And it later became, especially with ISIS, that it was actually a punishment of God for lack of religious observation. And this was interesting because then they used it to promote more of their version of religion. Something interesting that we're seeing more from the jihadist side, which I'd say is both from official outlets of media and then also unofficial, so supporters online, is this idea of conspiracy theories or anti-vaccination, anti-vax narratives. So on March 30th, Harakat al-Shabaab al-Mujahideen released a press release that talked about the AstraZeneca vaccine, and it highlighted some of the issues that we're seeing in normal media about the AstraZeneca vaccine. But then it also called on Muslims of Somalia to reject the vaccine, and then added on to attack the World Health Organization and UNICEF, who are trying to administer the vaccine in those regions. And then they said that instead of getting the vaccine, it's much better to use prescribed remedies for illnesses that you find in the Quran, so like black seed oil and honey. So this was interesting. Another way that especially we've seen ISIS highlighting off the pandemic, not just with narratives, but actually trying to use it in different nefarious ways, was in August of 2020, so we're already almost a year from now. But there was an alleged PP&E scam that was, as the Department of Justice said, by alleged ISIS supporters, and they were selling PP&E on a website. It was actually not official PP&E, so they said that some of it was certified, but it wasn't. I don't really know from the court documents that we had if people that actually try to purchase things like face masks and so forth actually receive them, but the funding from this PP&E was going to support ISIS. So that's an interesting turn in using the pandemic in a way for actually gaining funds for a terrorist group. As far as the othering, as I mentioned, this has been a huge thing that's been highlighted, and this is both jihadists, far right, etc. It's sentiments sort of like the virus is a Chinese virus, so anti-Asian sentiments, which we've seen, of course, across ideological perspectives, as well as from hate groups here in the States, and an uptick on attacks on individuals of Asian descent. Then there's concepts of the virus is a Jewish plot to control the world, so anti-Semitic narratives. And these are not new, of course, to many groups. They're things that we've heard throughout the years, especially anti-Semitic comments, but they use the pandemic to promote these narratives and this idea of the othering. As far as I said, some of the newer narratives we're seeing and the newer things in propaganda are a little bit more conspiracy theory leaning, even with the jihadists, and this is that the vaccines don't work, the vaccines are going to be used to attack the Muslim community, so you should be leery of them, excuse me. So these are very much anti-vaccine and then anti-whoever is administering the vaccines. On a final note, since I know time is short, I like to kind of mention some of the recommendations or counterterrorism recommendations, since I know we have a very diverse audience. I think the best things to think of when it comes to some of these narratives and the things that are being promoted, especially in the online world, is definitely the anti-vaccination narratives are worrying, because this is a highly contagious virus and we are all trying to become vaccinated. So providing accessible information to citizens is very important, and trying to get ahead of some of these conspiracy theories that are being promoted online by providing accurate and real-time information to your citizens. Also, another thing that we're seeing, especially here in the States and with far-right groups and those that are concerned about freedoms, which is a major concern, I understand, is some of the technology we have, either tracking if you've come into contact with someone that has been exposed to COVID-19, or also now we have all of these debates on vaccine passports and should individuals check to see if you're really fully vaccinated and so forth before allowing you to enter places or do things. And while this is very important, and I guess we're going to learn as we go as things change within the pandemic as well as the vaccines, you do need to keep that in mind, that some individuals will use this to promote more radical agendas as well as narratives among those that are paranoid and worried about these things. So I would say number one is capitalizing off of the conspiracy theories, but using that capitalization to provide accurate information for citizens. And then last but not least, one of the more worrying trends we have seen, especially with groups aligned with Al-Qaeda and so forth, is stepping in where governments cannot, in smaller towns and so forth, providing masks, enforcing stay-at-home orders. And while this is good to stop potentially maybe the spread of the virus, it is also slightly worrying, because down the line it can ingratiate communities to extremist groups that are stepping in and providing services that governments cannot. So that's something that governments need to be aware of and try to stay ahead of it if they can. I will stop there and let our next speakers go, but thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you for jumping up and speaking first. I really appreciated your effort to highlight some recommendations and considerations for the future. So for our audience, please be sure to submit questions as we go along, because once we wrap up for the 4 speakers, we'll dive right into the questions. But next up, we have Marc-André, who should be able to share his slides. So, perfect.
It works. We're good. So thank you, Chelsea, for stepping in. Thank you for the introduction, Audrey. So let's take a quick look at how extremism have reacted to the COVID-19 pandemic, focusing more on ideologically motivated violent extremists. So when the pandemic started, there was a lot of reporting that came out talking about what the predicted trends would be. And with the lockdowns happening at a global scale, the first general idea that was agreed upon was that violent extremist organizations that relied on public spaces for their activities to recruit new people, due to the restrictions on public gathering, travel, and all these type of movements, there'd be a decrease in offline recruitment activities. However, the general reporting also stated that due to the restrictions in place by these governments, in their attempt to curb the pandemic, violent extremist organizations would therefore have to focus their efforts on online recruitment. Was this successful? It's still debatable right now to see what the impacts are. I don't think there is enough information available to us to determine whether if this is a correct finding or not. However, it does appear that there is more quote unquote success. However, how that translates into actual mobilization or actual threats is something that has yet to be determined. What the actual trends have been, however, is interestingly enough, is the formation of new recruitment pools, especially as how the duration of the pandemic went from what was predicted to be a couple of weeks and a couple of months to over a year, has created long-term common grievances between not only ideologically motivated violent extremist actors, but also conspiracy theorists, extremist actors, conservative actors, whether it's about mandatory mask wearing, the lockdowns, travel restrictions, closing of churches or other religious institutions, the origin of the virus, or even how serious it is. All of these common narratives have brought disparate groups together and have formed new ecosystems and new relationships, especially in online spaces. And again, the length of the pandemic and the global protests that have happened have also broken the mold, and it's really expanded the lineup for other demographics, and it's provided different type of content for these movements, especially as we consider how, you know, all these individuals have come together, whether it's anti-vaxxers with far-right actors or all these other type of threats coming into a single space. Now, when we're looking at lockdown, mass vaccines, deplatforming, the type of ecosystems and ideologies and conspiracies have all had similar crossovers with each other. What's basically has happened is that it's no longer, you know, isolated in disparate ecosystems. And whether we're talking about, you know, deep states conspiracy theories, anti-establishment, or it really comes down to the government is not properly handling the pandemic and there is a form of government overreach, and there are multiple ways to justify this and multiple ways to react to it. And what has happened is that as some reactions or some means of trying to deal with the pandemic have not been successful, others that are becoming more extreme are becoming viable solution for some of these individuals. This is where there is a trend that is something to keep an eye on, even though as there is a tail end of the pandemic that we could see, there is still going to be a next step when we do reach that critical mass of people who have been vaccinated. And the discussion is going to come around to what do we need to do to get to the level of vaccines that we need to get this herd immunity, or even consider once specific nations have met this threshold, there's reopenings. However, other parts of the world have not reopened yet and are still dealing with this. There's going to be two disparate view of the COVID-19 pandemic, which will echo within specific conspiracy theories as it was not a real threat, as it's no longer here, even though it's still being talked about in other parts of the world. There's still going to be this transnational dimension to it that needs to be considered, even though we might see it in the West as something that is slowly disappearing. Again, it's the interesting or the concerning part is how violent extremists and non-violent extremists have really come together. And QAnon acts as an interesting example in this, where not only was it a fringe group, and I don't think most of us would have been talking about this if it wasn't for the pandemic, we're seeing how conspiracy theorists, violence extremists, and extremists are really coming together and forming these new ecosystems and adopting each other's ideologies and leveraging each other's type of narratives to support each other. So not only are conspiracy theorists leveraging more extreme narratives, but some of the more violent extremists that might have laughed at some of the conspiracy theories are also adopting those within their narratives. And this type of symbiotic relationship is creating a rapprochement between all of these actors, which again, in the long term, is not something that we're going to be able to simply dismiss, as there is a base that's being established that will continue on post-pandemic. Key things that we do need to keep in mind, especially early on of the pandemic, was how governments were reeling and trying to deal with what was going on at scale, and the different narratives that were going on, which were normal as we're trying to understand, oh, you should wear a mask to deal with the pandemic. No, you should not. These early decisions taken by governments are still playing a role in how these threats are being perceived, and it's still being leveraged by a lot of these actors to recruit people and say the governments or these, institutions are not able to take care of us. However, we have solutions if we could take them down. Another important factor that we need to keep in mind is what has happened since January 6th. And this is really the large deplatforming of threat actors from mainstream digital ecosystems to alternative technology platforms. And again, what this has caused is that these smaller platforms don't have the capacity to necessarily deal with the influx of new users, whether they are conservative extremists or violent extremists that have really gone to these platforms, whether there are non-existent trust and safety teams, whether or not some platforms like Gab really just don't give a shit and are not going to do anything about this, or the fact that there's multiple platforms that are being used that are potential radicalization pipelines, but are novel in the CT space or are newly created. QAnon in particular has been very good at creating multiple platforms as a way of adjusting to their deplatforming. And though individually they might not have a large group of people, as a whole, it's still a decent amount of individuals that are representative. And these are all spaces that require a form of manual observation or leveraging OSINT methodologies to observe, as there's no big data solution that is methodologically sound at this moment to be able to collect all of this and analyze them in a big data aggregate way. And this is something that needs to be developed by the research community to get a better idea of what's going on in these spaces. And again, it's also shifting existing toolkits and threat assessments that were built over the past year to adjust for COVID-19. They also need to now be readjusted for what's happened since the start of 2021. Finally, what are the objectives that we've seen from violent extremist organizations over the pandemic? It's been really 4 topics, really. It's undermine democratic institutions, governments at the not only at the federal level, but also state or provincial or even local levels, determining what the type of freedoms have been imposed upon. We do talk a lot about how the federal governments are targeted by violent extremist organizations, but often the local levels are ignored. And this is where a lot of unreported incidents happen. And it also is a way to do a temperature check on what is fomenting at deeper levels. And these are the things that happen at the everyday that are ignored and not only need to be considered for proper research and making recommendations to either policymakers or platform, but also when it comes to the academic research that we do to make sure that we're not only considering larger players, but also considering smaller everyday actions. They also want to reinforce their narratives to find these type of strong narratives. The COVID-19 pandemic has really found resonance with homesteaders, militias, preppers, accelerationists that have really talked about the collapse of society and the inability of governments to deal with large crises, and their fantasies to an extent have been proven within their own ecosystems, or they're able to twist what has happened to demonstrate their point of view. And that has been attractive to a fair amount of individuals. Also, it's important to understand that larger amorphous movements that kind of fall out of violent extremist organizations like QAnon also have adapted these and have grown. And even larger conspiracy theory communities who were not upfront as they were in the past few years are playing a larger role in mainstream conversations about this. And we're seeing this resonate at the influencer level when it comes to making decisions. Recruitment, this is still something that's debatable, but it does look like it has led to an increase in potential recruitment pools. the economic impact of the pandemic, perceived government overreach, social isolation, social and political uncertainty. All of these are vulnerabilities that could lead individuals to radicalize further. Moonshot CVE did do some research early on to indicate that there was a significant increase for far-right extremist content that was searched on Google in Canada and the US. But again, is this due to data voids in the search engines for people looking for specific type of content? Or is it really because these individuals were seeking out extremist contents? It's debatable when you consider that a lot of the conspiracy theories that exist in these data voids will automatically lead people to extremist content. So this could be a red herring, but it is something that merits a little more examination, especially a year and a half down the road. And finally, I think the important part is how COVID-19 has been able to inspire a fair amount of action by violent extremists, whether it was the Boogaloo Boys early on, whether it was Michigan's Wolverine, who had a kidnapping plot, 3%ers with multiple individuals being arrested over the year for plots related to the pandemic, or Black Lives Matter, or the election, all combined into one beautiful storm. QAnon, the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers. We've had individuals pose different types of threat as well, whether it is derailing a train, burning down cell towers, targeting at vaccine clinics, attacking government buildings, targeting politicians, attacking protesters, or even attacking law enforcement. We've seen threat vectors cross infrastructure, political institutions, democratic institutions, and the whole gamut within this short period of time. And I think this is something to keep in mind, that it's not only a single type of threat, but critical infrastructure has played an important role. It's not only necessarily about the loss of life, but losing critical infrastructure like cell towers or vaccine stations during a pandemic is something that's significant. And individuals that are not necessarily part of traditional violent organizations have been at the root of these attacks. The burning of cell towers was not an organized movement, but individuals motivated by conspiracy theories. This is a shift in how individuals have behaved. And I think this is something that needs to be highlighted in regards to how extremists have acted during the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is all for me, so we could take some questions.
Okay, great. Thank you for your comments. I think two things that are really interesting that I'd sort of like to pick up later are, number one, about how these groups are really interesting, or not even groups, but also movements and ideas. Organizational structure is something that's fascinating to circle back to, but also how the different movements are able to sort of leverage each other's content to validate and maybe sort of popularize their own views even more. So very, very interesting. So Dr. Loadenthal, you're up next. Hopefully your slides work as well.
Sure. You're able to see this?
Yep.
Super. So thank you for having me, for inviting me. I was asked to present on COVID as it relates to the far right, which is something that, a lot of people are talking about. So just, a minute on who I am. I'm, like many people, at a lot of different institutions right now. So I work for the University of Cincinnati as a postdoctoral research fellow. I also work as a research fellow for George Mason University, part of some grants with START UMD, and then I work with GNET and as a professor for the Global Center for Advanced Studies. We also run something called the Prosecution Project, which I would encourage people to check out, which provides free data to journalists and policymakers who are interested in studying political violence. So you can check us out. So I think, everyone seems to agree on one thing, right? One is that the pandemic has led to increased conspiracy theories and misinformation on so many topics, most centrally kind of the origin spread of the virus, as well as the government's mitigation efforts. The understanding is shared and repeated by a lot of Western governments. So Canada, Germany, Australia have all put out pretty similar reports, and they all seem to agree that the pandemic has not only kind of opened up opportunities for violent non-state actors to capitalize on, many of which we have already talked about in the last few minutes, but also that the increased government regulation, increased economic and political precarity, and the kind of general lack of control individuals feel can serve as a kind of potent accelerant. And so that's kind of my thesis today. And again, I have two images. The one in the upper right, I remember seeing really early, this was around May of 2020. This was an image put out by Palestinian Islamic Jihad showing the production of rockets and mortars, but they were really keen to show the use of hand sanitizer and the use, and the use of gloves and whatnot. So yeah, so it's it's not every day that you kind of see that. And so COVID and its state mandated mitigations, it served to accelerate the far right's efforts for sure. And it served more interestingly to kind of build strange allyships and cross pollinations between people we would consider violent and maybe non-violent or less violent. So before reviewing the narratives, which seem to have the most kind of widespread repetition amongst the far right, I want to review the kind of themes that they all collectively speak to. In a sense, I'd like for us to begin with the generalizable and then quickly move into the more specific. So I've noted at least kind of 4 recurrent explanations that are throughout all of these discourses. Daruti. And while they kind of occur in different proportions throughout the various, conspiracy-minded narratives, they're all part of this far-right nexus. So one is that we see an obvious rise in xenophobia and kind of nativism, often manifesting in a sharp rise in anti-Asian and anti-Semitic violence and harassment. And this is in large part due to the various explanations for how and why the pandemic has occurred. So again, that's been levied upon Asian folk and levied upon Jewish folk. And so the kind of explanatory reasoning behind the pandemic has led to rationalized violence for some. 2 is that we've seen heightened and more generalized critique and rejection of the state, right? Specifically state-centric public health initiatives. So calls from sovereign citizens, militia, boogaloo folk, accelerationists, other members of the kind of neo-Nazi far right, as well as the kind of less well-defined, anti-lockdown folks who are kind of born from this pandemic. They've created strange bedfellows and cross-pollinations between people who were on the, the centrist right or even parts of the far right to people who are really prone to violence. And 3, we've seen the popularization of accelerationism beyond the kind of neo-Nazi communities we had come to expect it, the kind of Turner Diaries inspired communities. So, we've seen this kind of accelerationist logic spread to survivalists and prepping communities, to advocate for this kind of, war or conflict. And finally, while not an element of the narrative, so much of the media from the far right is showing an intentional capitalizing on the isolation and increased screen time driven by the pandemic, something both of our previous speakers mentioned. So for one, it allows people with pre-existing grievances to become more aggrieved, but also it allows people to really increase this echo chamber. So the FBI and a number of other people have pointed out that, what we have that beyond these specific narratives is that we see this kind of blending of ideologies. We can easily see this in the incorporation of Salafi jihadi imagery and cultural reference points circulated by accelerationist neo-Nazi networks, such as those that are shown above, which mix Islamic State media, including this kind of very famed, around February of 2019 video, which shows the creation of explosives from acetone peroxide in someone's home, and combining that image, which you see in color, with the image on the far left, with the black sun and with other, with swastika and other things. And so you can see these kind of intentional mixing behind these ideologies. And this is one of the results of putting folks together in the same communities. And again, you can see this quote from Ray, where he talks about the use of blended ideologies, about groups developing less and less coherence. And again, there's a ton of examples of this, but I want to really focus just very specifically on the far right and Salafi and nationalist groups. And so again, here's just 3 really fast examples people are probably familiar with. The first is, right here, this is the Michael Solomon and Benjamin Teeter case. These are the folks who were manufacturing silencers and giving them to who they thought were Hamas. So this is kind of a mix of accelerationist, boogalooing, and kind of anti-state, anti-police, and then support for Palestinian nationalists. We also have the case, which is, kind of photographed down here by this famed montage. This is Ethan Melzer. This is the person who planned to have his army unit ambushed, and so was cooperating with, Satanist neo-Nazi Order of the Nine Angel folk, as well as some other interesting people. And then this image on the far right just came out a few days ago. This is from the National Socialist Club, a neo-Nazi network out of New England. And they're capitalizing on the Israeli-Palestinian flare-up here by actually developing and building stencils, which on a techno level must be really challenging to do, but building stencils of the Shahada and putting that above a stencil that says "Death to Israel." So in sum, what we see is a kind of recurrent parts of the ways in which the far right is discussing COVID. Above is what I would call elements of the far right conspiracy soup. So this is not kind of specific to COVID, but these are the kind of various parts that make up the far right's conspiracy network tropes. And I kind of highlighted in red the parts that are more exaggerated during the pandemic. I should also say I want to show one final slide after this, and there are some potentially shocking or troubling images on it. But you can see that obviously the response to lockdown, the fear of impending crisis, increased economic precarity, et cetera, anticipated mass civil unrest, right? People who are in the States are well familiar likely with the fact that ammunition for handguns and rifles has been sold out in the United States for like a year because of people stockpiling and panic buying, et cetera. And so in conclusion, the kind of far right, including its most conspiracy-minded parts, is trying to make sense of and capitalize on the COVID-19 global health pandemic in predictable but very worrisome ways. Generally, I would say their response, which kind of heavily overlaps with this kind of conspiracy and disinformation narratives, center around what I would break up into 5 kind of distinct themes. And this is kind of the taxonomy I developed. All of these 5 themes can be reflected in these gross images above, all of which were sourced from Telegram in the early months, I would say in the first 3 to 4 months of 2020. So what are these 5 narratives? Okay, number 1, that the virus is intentionally created to facilitate the government lockdown. This sort of shock doctrine notion that this was a intentionally created crisis in order to usher in social control. And this is thought to be done in the US, at least, often to threaten Second Amendment protections, to threaten the right for people to own firearms. The notion is that you create this virus, it causes panic, you're able to then justify a reduction in civil liberties, and then people can declare martial law, right? It's somewhat akin to the plot of the Turner Diaries for some folks. The second kind of recurrent narrative that we see thematically is that COVID is an intentional bioweapon, often assumed to be kind of cooked up by this, often labeled as the International Consortium of Jews, or the CDC, or the United Nations, or Bill Gates, or George Soros, or even a state-backed weapon by China or Iran, I've seen. And that this bioweapon is used specifically to target communities defined by race, ethnicity, religion, nationality, political belief, et cetera. Number 3, that the pandemic is intended to create or foster insecurity, precarity, chaos, in a sense as an intentional effort to kind of adopt an accelerationist strategy by the state. And this is where you get some interesting diversity, whether people think it's the official government, right? It's the government writ large, or whether it's this notion of like a deep state, an element within the larger state, trying to kind of push these efforts. So there's an interesting inter-far right discourse on that. And lastly, and this is the one that I think is most easy to laugh at, but is also a little worrisome, is the overlap with 5G. Specifically that 5G technology, either that China caused COVID through 5G, which is bizarre, that 5G kind of softened up the body to allow people to get COVID, or that, and this one I really don't understand, that 5G actually spreads the virus itself, or increases its lethality. And that typically this is often talked about as part of a kind of United Nations backed plot to use new technology to impose new world order. So these are the kind of recurrent themes, and you can see all that. You can see the anti-Semitism in these images. Quite obviously, you can see the nativism and xenophobia. You can see the kind of lockdown things. You can see the kind of you can see a lot of scary themes there. So I'll stop there, and I'm excited for what we can do for questions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I think these are really, really building on top of each other. And I especially like how you really point out that, a lot of what we're seeing today is built on top of this foundation, and it's the same flavors, but they're just sort of coming through with the latest ingredients. So I think that that's a really great point. And again, building on the others. So please remember to continue submitting your questions as we get started. I already have a list, so if you guys don't go, you'll be subjected to all of my questions instead. So if that doesn't motivate you, I'm not sure what will. But next up, we have Ms. Mwangi, and you will be presenting, I believe, some of your master's research.
Yes, there you go.
There's your
audio. Yes, I will be. I want to share my screen right now. All right, so my paper that I worked on for my master's thesis was on the implications of pandemic to national security. And given that I am from Kenya, I decided to focus on counterterrorism operations in the Horn of Africa, specifically Kenya and Somalia during the COVID-19 pandemic. And as the other panelists have already mentioned, initially when the pandemic began, there was fears that the terrorist organizations and violent extremist groups will try to take advantage of more people being online to recruit more people. They will also try to incorporate their terrorist agenda or the extremist agenda with the pandemic to just try see how they can use the pandemic to their advantage. And finally, that they will try to position themselves as alternative service providers, especially in regions where the healthcare infrastructure and other human security needs were not really being provided by the government. And so the Horn of Africa presents a very interesting arena where Al-Shabaab tried to do all these three things during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in the beginning of 2020 till mid to late 2020. And so what I was trying to understand was whether the pandemic had any direct implications on how national security was upheld during the pandemic. And at the same time, understand whether there was any way in which the pandemic exposed how governments related with communities. And so based on the leadership framework of leadership as a process by scholars like Albert Murphy, I tried to understand whether there was really any mutuality, which is very good relationship between communities and Al-Shabaab and communities affected by the pandemic and the governments in the region. And so some of the things that I came across were, like, it was very interesting how initially during the beginning of the pandemic, before there were cases being reported in Africa, Al-Shabaab had initially said that this was a very good punishment from God to the West. This was at a time when there was a lot of misinformation that the people from Africa were immune to the pandemic, either because of climate or because of melanin in our skins and all sort of things that people were saying that were not really true. And so at that time, Al-Shabaab took that position and was actually against the government trying to impose closure on schools, closure on mosques, telling people to social distance. So Al-Shabaab was completely against that. But then as time progressed and there were cases being reported in Africa, then Al-Shabaab decided to change its position because they realized if they took that hard line, then they would lose the popularity that they have amongst the population. So another thing that they did during this time was to delegitimize the governments in the region. And the fact that some of the governments in the region, for instance, the government of Somalia was accused of being corrupt in terms of handling of the donations that were given to help people affected by COVID-19, gave Al-Shabaab a very good point to say that this government is not even legitimate. And so instead of trying to work with them, why don't you come to our clinic that we've set up for you in Gilib? And during the entire time when I was doing my research, it wasn't clear whether there was actually a clinic set up because it was very difficult for me to be able to go to the field. But then conversations with people from the panel of experts on how to deal with panel of experts advising the United Nations Security Council were actually able to confirm that indeed the clinic was set up. Al-Shabaab was using that clinic to provide services, but it wasn't clear in terms of effectiveness and the numbers of people being treated and the equipment that they had. So we see that Al-Shabaab was very aware of how to maintain a good relationship with the population, which is very key for leadership because it shows that Al-Shabaab was aware of the needs of the people at the time, aware that people needed to get medical services, to get reliable access to information. So Al-Shabaab positioned themselves to do that. And at the same time, were able to take advantage of schools being closed to recruit more people recruit more people online, and at the same time move from traditional hotspot areas. So in a country like Kenya, where the hotspot regions have mostly been informal settlements in Nairobi, the Kenyan coast, and the northeastern province, because of the government's efforts to deal with Al-Shabaab recruitment and activities, then the group took advantage of the fact that there were other regions that were not really being looked at keenly. And so they started recruiting people from regions that were initially not seen as Al-Shabaab friendly regions. And so I think one of the things that I learned that was very interesting was that during a crisis, it's very important for leaders to know how to support their communities, because failure by governments to do that leaves the communities vulnerable to groups like Al-Shabaab that then position themselves as being there to provide crisis management, to help the communities cope with the changes that they're going through. It also means that even though Al-Shabaab was not very clear on the kinds of services they were providing. The fact that they had given a radio announcement with a phone number that people could call, and even journalists called to ascertain that that had happened, it shows that Al-Shabaab was able to intervene and position itself very effectively. And so if the government of Somalia and even the Kenyan government is going to counter that, then they also need to be very agile, very flexible, and to not forget that as much as you're setting up clinics, you also need to have a media campaign that informs people about what you're doing. And so we found out that the GLIP clinic was actually set up, and in future, it's important for researchers to find out how effective it was, to just be able to compare what the government of Somalia was doing vis-a-vis what Al-Shabaab was doing in that clinic. And so in terms of how the pandemic affected the counterterrorism operations, we see that there was a reduction in intelligence collected because of how the operations against Al-Shabaab were forced to scale down. We also see that new deployments were more difficult because of the need to social distance and the fact that some people were working from home, and the fight against Al-Shabaab has often meant that Al-Shabaab loses territory from time to time and then is able to regain that. So it became very complicated for the counterterrorism operations to continue effectively. But then at the same time, the fact that people needed to socially distance, the soft power approach to dealing with Al-Shabaab was also more complicated. So it was difficult for the government stakeholders from Somalia to meet with their AMISOM and other partners fighting against Al-Shabaab, to have dialogue processes, to have trust building, some of which cannot be done on a virtual platform because you need to sit down with the actual people, understand where they're coming from. And so that takes time. And so even in the aftermath of the pandemic, it's going to be very important to find ways to build trust, to have that dialogue, so that as the communities are trying to heal and move on from the COVID-19 pandemic, then they're in a position to effectively deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, the fact that governments like the Kenyan government was accused of using excessive force to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic means that people now feel more disconnected with the government and could easily feel as though Al-Shabaab is providing an alternative governance system for them. Because if Al-Shabaab is providing medical services and your own government is using excessive force against you in the name of regulating and trying to protect you from COVID, then it becomes very easy for people to be drawn to the terrorist organizations. So in future, it's important to have more funding for counterterrorism missions, so that even if there's a pandemic going on, they're not forced to scale down and bring troops from the field to back home to deal with the national security issues at home. It's also important that governments are in tune with the people that they're leading, so that they're not disconnected, because if Al-Shabaab realizes that the pandemic is going to get them support, if they set up a healthcare clinic, then even the governments should be easier and should be quicker to do that. And also that flexibility on counterterrorism, on counter narratives is important both on online and offline platforms, because Al-Shabaab was able to do that very effectively. And so even as we continue to observe how the group is using the COVID-19 pandemic, governments must be very careful how they do the counter narratives, and that you cannot only invest in state security and expect to have effective counter violent extremism. You have to combine that with human security, because at the end of the day, if people don't have access to water, to healthcare, to education, to very basic needs, then they're not going to follow you as the government. They're going to be more aligned with Al-Shabaab. And so I think COVID-19 presents a very good platform for us to learn about how terrorist organizations leverage on crisis that are not physically related to security, but more on the human security aspect. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you for your comments. And I think that you've highlighted a lot of really interesting points. And I love that we were sort of able to end the presentation series talking about the counterterrorism efforts and how it's affected counterterrorism efforts. And I think one point you made in that I found especially interesting was that social distancing has reduced dialogue. And I think that this shows really poignantly that there are both online and offline components to this, and they actually are really intermingled, because once we sort of reduce in-person dialogue, we, sort of sometimes turn to our virtual worlds or these supplementary communities. So just to sort of tee up a first question, and then I'm going to go to questions from the audience. And I'd sort of like us to think in mind about how we can connect the online and offline here, but all of your presentations really show how COVID-19 gave a bit of a rallying point for violent extremist groups. So either a rallying point so everyone can sort of unite and focus under one banner, or gave opportunities to fill a void, providing services or providing information or providing solutions and sort of guidance. So what other events do you think can fill the same mold? Will we see similar events like this? Are groups learning to sort of be opportunistic about leveraging these current events? And if so, what will future events be, and how might that shape the activities of violent extremist organizations? And any of you guys can jump right in. Chelsea, do you want to go first?
So I think the concept of groups highlighting off of the pandemic and a current event, especially a global event, is really not something new. They've always highlighted off of things happening in the news and so forth to, excuse me, to promote their causes. And we even saw that with all of the protests here in the United States in the last year over killing of individuals and so forth. And so the idea of latching onto something current and using it for your own purposes is not something new. As far as future events, I mean, I think we'll just see the same thing. When there's something that gains news or is newsworthy, groups are going to highlight off of it, because there is this idea of the propaganda of the deed, and the propaganda is what in some cases keeps some of these groups alive if there's really not a lot going on the ground, or if they've lost territory. I will let someone else elaborate on that maybe.
I think we all agree that this is not a new phenomenon. I think the one thing that's unique about COVID is the global nature on how every single region of the world was affected by this. Yes, we've rallied around specific conflicts or specific disasters, but this is the first thing that where everyone has been affected by this in a way, and these type of common grievances are important. The future type of event that will lead to this, and I think it's something we need to talk about and urgently, even though it's something we've been talking for a while, is climate change, because that is the next type of global phenomenon that will affect everyone in a similar way, that will have an impact not only on extremism, but also everything else. And I think that we should have been talking about this for a while, but really we're getting to a critical inflection point. And the pandemic shows how a natural phenomenon could really affect the entire world in important ways. And we're not ready to really understand that. So this goes beyond trying to convince the climate skeptics, but those of us who are working these spaces, we need to consider, how climate change will have this impact, and start demystifying some of the existing myths about how climate change could impact violent extremism, looking at what's happening right now. And I think that is a space that we need to keep our eyes on if you want to be a little bit more forward thinking.
Yeah, one thing that the pandemic shows us is how quickly people can pivot to current events. And I think specifically, amongst the far right and other groups which tend to use, networks like Telegram, you can see within 48 hours of an event, there's thousands of postings, there's hundreds of groups. So I think what we're getting used to, us as researchers and observers, is the speed to which people are just able to pivot and be like, oh yeah, that's proof of what I was saying too. And oh yeah, so is that. And so as the kind of new events come up, they're kind of folded into this pre-existing logic and rationale. And I think that, again, we as observers of that are being a bit more adept at trying to disentangle and make sense of that. But for example, the blaming certain ethnic groups, I mean, that goes back literally thousands of years to every public health crisis that's ever existed. So none of that's new. But I think the speed at which we're seeing people kind of fold these logics in is really what we're all trying to make sense of.
I think, like in the case of Al-Shabaab, what we see is be trying to position themselves as service providers is, again, not something new, as has been mentioned by the other panelists. We see rebel groups in different parts of the world trying to position themselves as alternative service providers. We have the SPLMA in South Sudan. We have groups affiliated in Latin America trying to provide those services. So it goes to show that the failure by governments to provide services means that there will always be groups that realize that the continuous use of force to try achieve what they want is not going to always be productive. So they will try to find softer ways of building sort of cohesion with the groups in the region they operate in, because they realize that if they continue to only depend on force, then they could easily be betrayed by the communities in those regions. But then if they position themselves as the go-to people, the service providers, then those communities will have more legitimacy and will view them as more legitimate and trust them more than the government trying to do its work. So I think it presents an opportunity for governments to get back to the drawing board, to rethink how they communicate with people, because failure by the government and institutions to provide credible information will leave their communities vulnerable to misinformation and exploitation by some of these groups.
Okay, great. Thank you all for your answers and different sort of perspectives on that. So I'm going to start teeing up questions from the audience, and please keep those questions coming in. So the first one is going to be, what strategies can be used for preventing extremism among more moderate pandemic, PLANDEMIC, anti-vax and conspiracy theory believers, both on a policy level and perhaps on a personal level too, as in what family and friends who are sort of noticing these trends can do to intervene with their own family and friends, given that much of it sometimes polarizes the conversation even more.
I don't have a family and friends answer, but as far as a kind of broad national policy answer, people's basic material needs need to be met better. And those, whether it's Al-Shabaab or Hamas or Hezbollah, or your local conspiracy theorist online, that gap is going to be filled by other folks when when it's not able to be filled by public health. So, in the States where public health is not something everyone has, where access to good medical care is not something everyone has, those gaps created are filled. Those vacuums are filled by nasty stuff. And so I think that, if we're trying to prevent people from going down this path, then providing people with, adequate or dare I say above adequate healthcare would certainly be a good thing, so they don't turn to other sources of information, other sources of community support, which are typically some of these areas we're talking about.
I think another important, at least from a policy perspective, is also to consider how a lot of the content that we've seen around the pandemic is not necessarily something that is part of existing legislation, at least at a government level or even at a platform level. There is no ways to deal with this type of content. Everyone is kind of struggling with, how do you remove specific content, specific disinformation? How do you do that in a human right respecting way as well? And, who is the arbiter of truth in a lot of these discussions, especially when we're talking about an individual's perception of how to deal with their own body and their own health. And it is a very touchy subject, and it is very touchy not only in the West, but also in other parts of the world where they've had different histories with how, if we're thinking about Africa or Latin America, how Westerns have come and tried to apply their medicine or for specific type of treatments. And that is something that we need to consider. And how do you attribute those type of conversations? Because you could say, okay, I'm going to silence the conspiracy theorists whose anti-vaccine narrative fits X, Y, and Z. But if you're using that same type of narrative in a different nation, silencing that would have a whole different type of impact when we're talking from a human rights perspective. And that is something that is difficult. From the friends and family perspective, one of the biggest challenges, especially when it comes to conspiracy theorists, is after a year and a half, people have just gotten sick about having this conversation, and there's a lot of disengagement. And I think that's one of the most difficult things to recommend, because it's not necessarily something that, if you're doing this on a daily basis, it has to suck. But try not to disengage, because ultimately, if you're not there to provide a counter voice, and they're in these alt text spaces where there are no counter voices, all they're going to hear is the exact same message that they want to hear. So if, the search engines optimized for them to receive disinformation, if their digital ecosystems are based on disinformation, you actually are the only lifeline to a counter message. And as difficult that as it is for friends and family, it's really about trying to engage that conversation, not to be derisive, not to be mocking, but trying to understand why they're going down to get this information and trying to provide the information they need, but also try to fill the void. There's a reason why they're looking for answers in these spaces. So what can you do to get there, or what type of help can you recommend? And the second one again is, how can establishments provide resources to the public to direct people to this type of help, whether it's exit programs or even social programs or whatever needed. I don't know of many. I know, organizations like Counter Hate or when all those things, they do work in these spaces, but talking about a violent extremist and a conspiracy theorist is not the same thing. The toolkits are not the same, and they need to be adapted, and more resources need to go there. And that's a gap we need to fill, not only because the pandemic has taught us so now, but this is going to continue. The pandemic leaves, the need to find this information not going to go away. So we have a pool of conspiracy theorists, and if it's not this, is it going to be our electoral processes? Is it going to be about specific races? Is it going to be about all these other issues? It's going to move somewhere else. So it is something that we need to deal with, and it's not going to disappear. We can't have this mystical view.
And I'll jump in on that. I think, especially on the family and friends sphere, because I've been personally dealing with this, and it's really worrying when you see people that go down this rabbit hole that you as a researcher are like, oh, no, don't do that. But it's really, like Mark was saying, keeping engagement, although it can be hard sometimes because individuals maybe do not want to engage. And so you have to deal with it very carefully. But I'm also seeing it coming not so much from the cyber environment, the online environment, but actually from friends of family and friends. And they talk to each other. Someone gets a source of information from God knows where. And then in personal conversations, it just snowballs from there. So once again, accurate information is important. But when you think of it, a lot of these conspiracy theories and misinformation tends to come out of personal fears. We didn't know what was going on, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. And then we have this vaccine that initially we didn't know what was going on as well. And there's a lot of fear surrounding all of this. And so certain actors, of course, highlight off of that. That's what conspiracy theories are. They provide an answer when potentially there aren't clear answers, or someone is trying to figure out how their world works at a specific time. So understanding that this comes from a level of fear and working off of that to provide information to people that personally, family, friends, and so forth, is really important. So it's a delicate situation, and you need to deal with it in a delicate way. And hopefully that will shed some light to people that might be getting information off of, I will say, YouTube, for the people I know, has been the platform that has caused, I think, some of the most problems as far as information.
If I could add something else, I'd say it's important to build people's resilience in terms of the critical thinking, teaching people basic skills on how to identify misinformation, how to question the information they get before they share it. Because like Chelsea mentioned, most of these people are so scared that they're sharing it out of like it's coming from a good place. So being empathetic enough to know that they don't know any better, and explain to them in a very empathetic way that shows them the danger of them sharing that information without it being verified, so that they maintain the good intentions that they have with the information they share. And also governments and communities supporting experts on the subject. So the World Health Organization, international and regional organizations that work on health issues, giving that, like having governments acknowledge that they're not always going to be the leaders. Sometimes they will have to listen to multiple voices, people who are experts on climate change, for instance, people who are experts on migration. So they don't have to lead if they don't know where they're leading people to. It's important for them to learn, and once they unlearn these other things, that they don't have to always be in charge, then the real conversations begin to happen.
Okay, great. Thank you for all of your answers, and also for sort of sharing some personal anecdotes, because I think it's sort of something we're all grappling with, but it also highlights the opportunity space that there are so many entry points for us all to lean into these conversations. But with that, I want to sort of highlight one of the questions that says, to what extent does the random and unpredictable nature of the pandemic further the conspirators' narrative? And can we, by extension, say that chaos or randomness is beneficial to extremist narratives? And one thing I want to add to that too is just uncertainty and confusion. So even in the US, for example, CDC guidelines, or knowing that when I go to work, can I wear my mask and when I'm with other people, but not when I'm at my desk, and when can you do what? And just the confusion there may be an opportunity space. So could you guys speak to that a little bit too?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly see that a lot in the far right communication, the general speaking to like a feeling of loss of control, of, again, greater precarity, greater insecurity, whether that's economic or health related. You can certainly see that. I did a study looking at, why does the kind of new far right, the kind of neo-fascists always point back to the 50s and say like, this is a great time to be alive. And part of it is the perceived, and again, false, but the perceived kind of simplicity and predictability of life. And I think that that's something that we see a lot in the discourse is the world is changing too fast. It's too unpredictable, whether it's economic crisis or migration crisis, or the so-called great replacement, or things caused by climate change, or things caused by disease. There is a notion that we being those in power, are losing control and predictability again. So I think there is this kind of notion, there's a high degree of anxiety caused by people's inability to predict the future. And that anxiety is clearly a potent part of any sort of radicalization formula. And you can really see that communicated in the kind of pessimism of the kind of meme culture the far right uses, the kind of dystopian, tongue-in-cheek, it's going to be bad is kind of the overarching theme. So anyone who just looks at the images of this, I'll say one last thing. If you want to get a kind of sense of the feeling amongst these forums, don't read them. But if you're using something like Telegram, you can view them via media and just look at the kind of image collages that make up these ecosystems. And you'll get this really obvious, overwhelming sense of anxiety and precarity that I think speaks to a lot of these issues.
I think to echo one thing that Michael was saying earlier on too, is the speed at which these actors are able to adapt to these events and it was a challenge, especially as I was a public scholar at Concordia the past year. And when you're trying to keep up publicly with what is happening in these ecosystems, you're seeing multiple narratives on every day. And as a researcher trying to keep up, you move on day to day and try to keep up with this type of stuff. And these events are happening faster than the speed of scholarship, and it's happening way faster than the speed of governments, academia, governments, law enforcement. We're all these institutions that are very slow, and there are reasons behind that. Speed is not necessarily our forte. However, for threat actors, speed is their forte, and being able to jump from one cause to the next from, we're going to talk about, these type of actors and these pandemics, and it's like, all of a sudden it's not only the deep states and Soros, it's look at this, it's also this event, and here's pandemic, and here's some frontline doctors, and here's the Wayfair conspiracy theories, and then here's something about, really it's not, Bill Gates' wife, Melinda Gates, is actually a man and she's been replaced by a clone, and we're back to we shouldn't wear masks, and the vaccine's going to give you a chip, and it's just, that's pretty much like a 7-day of analysis in the far right conspiracy world right now, and it's nauseating. But there are actually individuals in these communities that keep up to this, and this forms their worldviews. And this is what, it goes to what Michael's talking about, the anxiety. It's not only the memes, it's not only the content, but it's the speed at which bad things are being sent to you. Everyone and everything is perceived to be a threat and something bad. So obviously you do feel that you're in this apocalyptic world. But then the scary part is, if you're a conspiracy theorist who's been pushed in these more extreme ecosystems, you're going to find that there are established messages with accelerationists or, homesteaders and preppers that have been talking about, shit hitting the fan for years. And they're talking, look at my garden, look at all this food I have, look at all this ammo. And these new normie conservatives that are popping in these ecosystems, they're like, oh my God, these guys are ready. We're all going to die. And it feeds into this anxiety. And then, but it's also, if they're doing this, I need to do this. So you also have this vicious cycle of rapid radicalization because of this scenario. And it's successful. Will this lead to mobilization? Maybe not. You might have a bunch of new homesteaders that'll be sitting on caches of food, toilet paper, and ammo and will do nothing. Then again, you might have some that will behave. And this is basically what we have is a bunch of loaded guns, and we never know if people are going to pull the trigger or not. And that's what the concern is.
I believe that a way that governments can effectively help societies deal with the uncertainty and the confusion is to identify who are the right partners to work with at what times. So for instance, if a group like Al-Shabaab is using religious undertones to spread their message, then governments have a responsibility to work with religious leaders to reassure people that them taking care of themselves and their communities is not going against religious teachings. If anything, it's building up on their religious duties. So knowing who to work with, and at the same time, governments need to invest in strategic foresight and strategic anticipation. Of course, they can never be able to predict all the black swans that can come out of nowhere, but then the fact that there had already been a lot of information about the likelihood of there being a global pandemic, the next crisis is going to be climate change, we've already been told. So are we doing anything to prepare communities to deal with that effectively, or do we just sit as ducks and wait until something happens and then we're all rushing to try provide solutions? So I believe strategic anticipation and right partnerships are key to reassure communities that everything will eventually work out. But governments have to take leadership. If they don't, then the gaps will be filled by other people.
Absolutely. So because I want to keep an eye on the time, I'm going to combine these last two questions and we'll sort of do a quick fire and then a wrap up. So again, sort of combining these two questions. One is, do mainstream media play a role or have they become irrelevant? And this is sort of a different aspect of this, but given the online dimension of the problem and the challenges, how do you see the role of providers or tech companies and their role in curbing fake news? So, just taking media as a topic for you guys to tackle in a quick fire Q&A. So go ahead and pick that up as you like, and then we will get ready to wrap up for today.
I think that content moderation is really important here, right? And a lot of us work in the space of content moderation. And certainly that can get better, but I want to kind of look at it in a different way, is that the way in which, again, I'm just speaking about the far right, but the way in which the far right interprets and reacts to content moderation has been really interesting to observe. So, you have platforms like Telegram, which notably has very little content moderation, or at least, after the January 6th riots, they kind of shut down a bunch of channels. Then a couple of days later, they're all back up. But, what's really interesting about that is the perceived persecution by the far right by tech companies. And again, I don't have a conclusion about whether it's a net benefit or a net loss, but what we gain in the moderation of content, we lose some degree of that for people feeling persecuted. And these people feel boxed in. They feel that the government's coming after them. They feel that this is the first step of, ironically, a kind of authoritarian takeover. They feel that their speech is being limited. They feel that this is proof of this kind of forced push towards PC multiculturalism, et cetera, et cetera. So what's really interesting is the interplay between deplatforming some of these entities, and one of the results of those deplatformings being people feeling like everyone's ganging up against them. And specifically, seeing, for example, Trump kicked off of major media, that was a potent part of this. Some of the kind of shadow bans have been a potent part of this. So when I don't really work in the policy sphere, but as people move to changing these policies at the level of Facebook, or at some of the levels that GIFCT, for example, is working in, we want to make sure that the efforts to limit the ability for these groups to find stable footholds in commercial environments is also not leading to them feeling like everyone's ganging up against them. Because as we know, people who are prone to violence oftentimes move towards violence when they feel acute moments of persecution and lack of options. And that's certainly something we're seeing, certainly something I'm seeing within the far right communication.
So the whole deplatforming, removing content and so forth is a whole nother talk. I have a couple of thoughts on it, just because this is a question that comes up a lot. And while I totally support deplatforming and removing content, it also creates another issue. So if you use ISIS, for example, there was a huge Europol crackdown on the group in 2019. And when that happened, they shut down a lot of accounts on Telegram and other platforms that they were on. And people thought, okay, that will be it, they're gone. Because of course, ISIS has a habit of popping up, constantly recreating accounts once they're taken down. However, since it was so hard to get back on Telegram, which they had been pretty much conglomerated on, they were on other platforms, but Telegram was sort of their favorite virtual caliphate, as we like to call it. They scattered across multiple platforms, new platforms, up and coming ones that have already been out there that they tried and got kicked off of, but it scattered them everywhere. So it becomes somewhat of a choice, either have a group housed more on one platform so you can actually see what they're communicating and talking to as far as a counterterrorism measure. And then you have to understand that when you do get rid of them, they will find other ways. That's the joy of the internet. There are multiple ways of communicating, multiple ways of promoting propaganda. And if you have a will, you will find it. And there's always new technologies coming out and new messaging platforms. So it will always be a game of cat and mouse when it comes to deplatforming and removing content and so forth. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but you just have to understand that there will be a double-edged sword, and you can't, you're never going to be able to remove it completely.
Other insights?
Yeah, I would add that there is need for strategic communication by governments using different media platforms, because there was a question whether the media has now become irrelevant. I don't think the media is going to become irrelevant, because there's places where you still don't have as much internet penetration. People still rely on newspapers and text messages amongst family members and all these kinds of communication. So strategic communication by governments to know how to address these different audiences, and also seeing the media as partners and not as a separate entity from what the government is doing. And that way the media won't feel like they're being censored, but they will be taught and work with the government to know how to self-censor the information they share and how to effectively counter misinformation and allow themselves not to, and refuse to be misused by groups that are working against the government agenda. And finally, like cooperation between the different tech companies with governments, with education institutions, so that everyone is working towards the same goal and not working in silos where the information is not reaching everyone.
I guess just to close up quickly, media we need more of, and especially local media. I think the struggles that media organizations have had, whether it comes to funding or keeping journalists at the local, federal, state, like at all the levels, we've seen, and I think there's been enough studies out there to show the negative impact this has had on our resiliencies as societies, and it's something we need more. When it comes to reporting, I think media, like researchers, this is something we're going to struggle with, but how do you report on something, and how do you bring awareness about extremists or conspiracy theories without, inducing a Streisand effect? And that's a challenge that we do every day as a researcher, where you want to raise awareness, where you need to raise the alarm. But again, it's how do you do that in a way that will be reducing harm as much as possible. When it comes to takedown, takedowns are the solutions that are always proposed because it gives the appearance that you're doing something to deal with the problem. And these are always done in 2 to 4 year cycles, because platforms and elected officials are going to want to do something to make it appear like they're dealing with this issue. However, it's very difficult to talk about the more difficult long-term approaches that would take to deal with societal factors that lead to radicalization. And the Band-Aid solution is great because, the media reports we did X amount of takedowns, this group is swept under the rug, and we don't have to deal with them anymore, when in reality, they're still active and they're still around. And it's really about, how do you want to look at this? If we look at the case of QAnon and the MAGA crowd that was the platform after January 6th, you basically pushed over 1 million people to alt tech platforms. When you're seeing Telegram channels with 300,000, 500,000, 800,000 followers talking about, Holocaust denialism, talking about white, supremacy, there's no channel on Telegram, there's no group in ISIS that had this amount of followers, that had this type of influence. And some of these influencers are lawyers, they're elected officials, some are just average citizens, some are medical practitioners, whatever you want. But they have type of influence that in the CT space, we're not used to dealing with. And though this may be happening on other platforms, this is going to bubble up on your Facebooks and your Twitters and your Instagrams and your YouTubes and your TikToks. The difference is that now as a platform, you need to decide, if I deplatform this group, am I pushing them into a space where they're going to become a threat actor that will pose a different type of threat? You need to consider, oh yes, it's easy to drop the ban hammer, but I don't know, I ban a bunch of mommy anti-vaxxers. Are you going to turn them into a bunch of mommy militias that are going to want to start targeting clinics? You know, you need to consider what is the long-term impact. And I think that the lazy responses of we're going to ban these group are no longer acceptable, but we need to start thinking about long-term resilience. And this is not a sexy solution. This is not a PR campaign. But at what point are we going to say enough is enough and start putting our heads together for what are long-term societal solutions that will actually deal with this issue? Because this is not going to go away. A new presidency did not sweep MAGA under the rug. It did not sweep extremists away. The pandemic disappearing will not sweep this away. So how do we move forward in a strong and structured way to continue fighting this in a successful manner?
Okay, thank you for those comments. And for our audience, I'm sorry we went a few minutes over. We're going to wrap up now. But first, I want to just thank our 4, well, potentially 5. We had a small but somewhat censored 5th panelist here today for their candid and insightful comments on violent extremism or violent extremist groups and their sort of responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. I want to especially thank you for your candid responses today and discussion. I honestly learned a lot from you guys, and it was a privilege to moderate this panel. Thanks also to everyone who came out online, especially for your patience while I showed that it is still possible to not be able to use Zoom successfully. So I'm glad I could display that for everyone here. We appreciate your patience with our tech issues and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.